Hello, everyone. I am Pete Davis, the director of the Democracy Policy Network, and welcome to the promise of state public advocate offices. With 42 states and 120 state legislators and staffers represented, we think this may be the largest gathering of state leaders interested in public advocate offices ever, or at least in a few decades. Again, a technical note, we're hosting this as a meeting instead of a webinar, so you can see the range of people that are interested in this, but to make that work, you have to stay muted. A bit on the Democracy Policy Network before we get into the meat of public advocate offices. We are an interstate policy network that works to empower people to raise up ideas that deepen democracy in the broadest sense of the term. More power to more people in more ways. We do that by first gathering and packaging and organizing promising ideas, policy ideas for deepening democracy, like public advocate offices. And second, holding briefings like this in front of folks like you, policy-minded, democratically spirited state leaders and staffers. If you want to learn more, you can visit democracypolicy.network. And since it is the holiday season, I have to plug, we just released for our next 100 donors, the This Is What Democracy Looks Like deck of cards, which is 52 promising policy ideas as a deck of cards that if you donate to us, and I will actually show you today, the 10 of hearts is public advocate offices. So if you get that deck of cards, if you become our donor at democracypolicy.network. But let's get to why we're here today. We're here today because there is a transformative model for government accountability, access, transparency, modernization, and citizen engagement that is present in a few places and only really fully realized in one major city in this country and has not yet widely spread across the country. And Delegate Vaughn Stewart of Maryland is ready to kick off a new era of spreading this model. He is submitting legislation for an elected statewide public advocate of Maryland, an independent liaison between Maryland citizens and the Maryland state government, whose office would be tasked with watchdogging the state government, receiving and responding and acting on citizen complaints about state government, facilitating democratic engagement in state government, and advocating for constructive, systemic solutions to the patterns seen in those citizen complaints. And to celebrate the beginning of this new wave and give guidance to it, we wanted to bring together past and present public advocates. So invited here today, we have Mark Green, the first public advocate of New York City. You can wave, Mark. We have Betsy Gottbaum, the second public advocate of New York. That's the first 16 years of the office, 1993 to 2009, represented here today. We also have Ron Chen here. Ron, who was the first public advocate of New Jersey after the office was restored in 2006. And we've also, we were waiting to see if he had arrived yet. Mike has the current public advocate, Jumaane Williams. Not yet. Okay, so current public advocate, Jumaane Williams, is on his way to arrive. He's fitting us in today, and he will be here as well. But to kick this off, as we wait for public advocate Williams to arrive, and Mike, just chime in when he does. I wanted to start with Delegate Stewart of Maryland. Delegate Stewart, why don't you introduce yourself and let us know why you wanted to submit this legislation this year?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Pete. It is an honor and a privilege to be here with everyone this afternoon to see many of your smiling faces. I'm Vaughn Stewart. I represent a part of the Maryland suburbs of DC. In the Maryland General Assembly. I've served in the House of Delegates in Maryland since 2019. This idea of a public advocate is actually something that I first became familiar with when I lived in New York City for a few years back about a decade ago. Until then, I'm not sure this idea was on my radar at all, but it was somewhere jammed in the crevices of my mind for having lived in the city. And then it was brought forth after actually I had a conversation with none other than Pete Davis, who you just heard from. We were just kind of kicking around a variety of policy ideas over coffee here in Maryland a few months ago. And when he mentioned this idea that maybe we could use New York City and New Jersey as a model to spread the public advocate office in Maryland and maybe eventually in more and more places, I was immediately transfixed. I was immediately intrigued. And here's why. I think we have a number of crises in the country, certainly, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic. But I think one of the most salient ones is a crisis of public trust. I think that the pandemic has exacerbated a pre-existing disconnect that people feel with each other. I mean, I think we certainly have a kind of crisis of community and loneliness in this country, but I think we also, an increasing number of citizens feel disconnected from their government. They feel like their representatives no longer listen to them. They no longer heed their concerns. And I think if you talk to any of the former or current elected officials on this call, they'll tell you the same thing, that when they go out knocking on doors, some folks are engaged and some folks, feel like they're a part of the process. But unfortunately, a growing number of people really feel like they're being left out and their voices are not being heard. And so I think the promise of the Office of the Public Advocate is the promise of engagement and ultimately of public trust. And in two ways. And of course, we'll hear more and more about all the different benefits of the office. But to me, two things really stand out. One, the watchdog aspect. Folks, I think across the political spectrum are constantly concerned about waste, fraud, abuse in their government. And I think to have an office whose job it is to heed and to take citizen complaints, and then to use that to make sure that government is clean and responsive, is something that can restore public trust. So at least, in the whole spectrum of elected officials out there, at least they know they've got one guy or one gal out there looking out for their interests and looking out for the citizens and making sure that government is responsive first and foremost to regular folks. And then the second idea is that the public advocate, I think one benefit is that person is going to be empowered to champion systemic pro-democracy reforms, and on a more holistic level, to try to bring power back to regular people so that they feel like they're part of the democratic process again, that they don't feel like every 4 years or every 2 years they cast a ballot and they go back and sit on their couch, but instead that they're an active participant in the policy-making process. And to me, that is really a big promise of the office, that this person who otherwise doesn't have a whole lot of day-to-day tasks assigned to them can make it their mission to bring regular people into the democratic fold. So not only do they feel like they can trust their government, that they're not screwing them over and wasting taxpayer money and doing kickbacks, but they also feel like they've got not only a front row seat to the action, but they're actually around the democratic table in making the decisions themselves beyond merely the ballot box. And so that's why I think this is really exciting. But at the end of the day, I'm going to shut up now because the real experts are on the panel who have actually been there and done that. And so I'm really, really grateful to deepen. Really grateful to Mike and to Pete and all their colleagues for bringing this amazing panel together. And I'm really grateful for all of you for tuning in, because I'm probably the most excited person on here, obviously, to learn from all of these folks that have been doing amazing work for the last several decades. So again, with a lot of gratitude and excitement, I'm happy to be here and I'm happy to explore this idea with everyone.
Thank you so much, Delegate Stewart, and thank you for reviving this model. And so I've said to all the panelists, this is half a pep rally for the model, but it's also directly advice session for Delegate Stewart and all the rest of you that want to bring this to your state. And we just had join us the current public advocate of New York City, Jumaane Williams. We're so glad that you've taken some time outside of advocating for the public of New York City to help spread this model that New York City has benefited from to other states, Public Advocate Williams. And since you have to go soon and get back to being the public advocate, we wanted to start with you as our first current or former public advocate. So Public Advocate Williams, you've greatly expanded the role of the Public Advocate Office. And I'd love to just start with this question, which is, what do you see as your mission as Public Advocate of New York? And what initiatives have you taken that might not be found in normal auditor or controller offices you see in many states?
Well, peace and blessings, love and light to everyone. Thank you for that question. Thank you for having me on this panel. Honored to be here with my predecessors, Betsy Gottbaum and the original himself, Mark Green. And I don't know if Ron is on here, but I didn't get a chance to work with him. I learned a lot, actually, just by reading that I would be on with him. I didn't even know New Jersey's history with it. And of course, Delegate Stewart for the work that everyone's doing. Obviously, I was able to build on work that was done by previous public advocates. I'm sure that my former public advocates would agree that a lot of it, based on the way we have it shaped, really you get to bring your brand of what should be done with the office. And in my case, as a former community organizer, I really worked around how best to help organize communities and get information up and down through organizing and get information up and down from us, from the government to the people, people to the government. So we greatly expanded the community engagement unit, hired some borough advocates, hired deputy borough advocates on issues, and we focus a lot on legislation. Very proud of the work we've done there. But just so you know, there's 5 charter mandated duties. One is you get to introduce legislation into the city council. You act as an ombudsman. You're a charter cop, making sure the agencies are doing the work that they charter demands. You have a vote on the pension board, and you get to appoint people to committees like City Planning Commission or CCRB, which is Civilian Complaint Review Board over the NYPD. The 6th one, which is not charter mandated, as the bully pulpit. I think we've done a good job of either being in the streets or being right where things are happening so we can help elevate those issues. One thing I'm proud that we've been able to do since I've got in for the first time, and this will probably make my predecessors a little jealous. We finally got an independent budget. So very often you had to work knowing that the very people you have to hold accountable can just chop your budget, which has happened previously. And now that is, it can't be just, cut in half. And so that's been exciting. There's still some more things we need, like subpoena power will make this office even more powerful to do the things that folks wanted to do.
Advocate Williams, your job is to watchdog the mayor. We're advocating for state public advocates to also watchdog the governor and other aspects of the government. And I assume mayors and governors like to say, this criticism of the model where they say, well, I'm the public advocate, they elected me to be mayor or governor, and why do we need this other office when every politician is supposed to be an advocate for the government? And we're here today to say there's a real use to this extra office of someone that's not in the day-to-day governing function. And I'd love to hear your case for why this independent office has been useful and your experience in New York City of how you found it useful.
There's usually when we're talking about holding people accountable, the people who we want to hold accountable will always give a reason why they shouldn't. We already have this, we already have that. And it's usually just another trying to kind of blockade. Interestingly enough, I ran for lieutenant governor in 2018. And I actually ran saying that we could turn the lieutenant governor's office into a public advocate's office because I felt like it was necessary to have something like that on the state level. I probably can't talk about what I'm doing now, but if that succeeds, I would champion something like that on the state level as well. But it is important, I think, to have someone independent of the legislature, independent of the governor, whose main job is to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And we've seen in far too many cases that they're not. And so having an office like this, well-funded, well-resourced, is important. So it is important to have something like an independent budget. I think it is important to give the office teeth so we can do the job that it's supposed to do. And I think most folks, when they hear about the function of the role the public advocate is supposed to play, understands it immediately. If not, sometimes our elected colleagues, who I think just don't want those folks, they don't want to be watched over as much as we want them to.
One of the reasons we turn towards the New York City model is because it's an elected public advocate, and there's a power in the fact that it's elected as opposed to appointed or as opposed to just being a random bureaucratic position like an inspector general or something of an agency. Our reason is that it helps bring a lot of attention to the office, thus giving it power and thus keeping the office close to the people. I'd love to hear about the fact that it was an elected office that you had to run for, affected your ability to to do your duty as a public advocate. Could you speak to that aspect?
There are pluses and minuses to appointments of things and elections of things. I do think this is the type of office that's best to be elected. This office was a great fit for me based on how I did my work as a council member. I think many people thought that as well. But for instance, I ran for speaker of the city council. That's a different kind of thing. That's some wheeling and dealing insider. I'm not really good at that, but I am good at raising issues on behalf of the people. So being able to make my case in front of the voters was actually helpful, because the voters are going to make their decisions. They may not be interested in the wheeling and dealing of power, but they're interested in hearing how somebody's going to help them keep their government accountable. And so making that pitch to the voters is important just for its own sake, but also it's given me even that much more freedom to do what I have to do, because I'm not answering to anyone else except for the voters.
Two more questions, because we know you have to go, Advocate Williams, so appreciate your time. First question is that the interesting thing about the public advocate office is you have this very practical task of responding to citizen complaints. And then you have this grand task of proposing systemic solutions. And we see that there's a connection there, because when you hear a lot of citizen complaints, you can see the patterns that need systemic solutions. So I'd love to hear about how your office and your experience in the connection between those two, both the hearing the individualized complaints and the writing the reports and advocating for legislation.
Well, we absolutely take our lead from what's happening on the ground, and having the robust community engagement unit helps us do that, so we can hear from people on the ground and we can hear from advocates on the ground, turn that into reports that we hope will help get legislation done. We did that with our report on mental health, hearing directly from folks who are affected by the lack of infrastructure and advocates who are fighting for. One of the first reports we did. And some things moved and some things we have to push some more on. Our racial impact study, it's the first time next year, anytime there's a rezoning in the city, we're going to have a racial impact for that rezoning. It was one of the bills that we got passed. And so we very frequently take a tab of what's happening. What are the complaints that we're getting in most of? Where are they coming from? What are they about? Can we do a report about this? Can we hold somebody accountable? Can we get a law change? Tomorrow, actually, I was about to say something that's, we're going to be coming out with our worst landlords list very shortly, I'll say. And a lot of that has to do with data that we're getting from websites of city agencies, but also from things that we've been hearing all throughout the year. So there's a great synergy there, and this is the perfect office to make sure that synergy happens, because we have a broader view. And even if you're a council member or a state senator or a state assembly, you may be looking at it from the purview of your district and may not have that bird's eye view, which makes the office that much more important. And of course, if you're the executive, then you may not want that bird's eye view being told, but it's my job to tell it.
That's wonderful. And thank you for breaking that news. The final question, Public Advocate Williams, this is a call of people that are excited to bring the public advocate model to other cities and states across the country. What advice and encouragement do you have for them?
Do it. I think it's a great model. You're going to hear from two previous public advocates who I know are going to add on to what I had to say, probably say it even better from the experiences they had. I'm still going through it, but it is a great role to have in government. I would say if you're going to do it, which you should, make sure it's properly resourced. Make sure it took far too long for us to get an independent budget, and we're still fighting to get subpoena power. So we have the power to ask questions, but in order to force them to answer, we have to go through the council to get a subpoena, or we have to sue them, which is a longer process. So do it, make sure it has the teeth that it needs to provide the independence that you want. But I think it's a great position, and I'm just glad that folks are thinking about it across the nation the way they are.
Thank you so much, Public Advocate Williams. I know you have to go, but so appreciate you taking the time to help spread this model to other cities and states.
Thank you so much, everyone. Peace and blessings, love and light to you all. I know you're going to do awesome stuff, Betsy and Mark. I'm sorry I can't stick around to hear the pearls of wisdom you're going to drop. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you, Delegate Stewart.
Bye.
Thank you all. And as Public Advocate Williams mentioned, we have 3 other public advocates here today, 2 from his fellow city in New York City and a state level public advocate, Ron Chen. Let's start from the beginning, though. The original public advocate of New York City is with us here today. It's a position that's been around for like 150 years in some form, but in the form it is today, started with Mark Green. So Mark Green, take it away. Tell us your story of being a public advocate. And then we'll go to the second public advocate, Betsy Gottbaum. So Mark, take it away, your experience and your advice for others proposing this model.
Peter, thank you. We could be an acorn growing, not just to a big tree, but around the country. This has never happened before when there's been a systematic effort to corral the experiences of those who have done it and how to spread it. I will start with history, not with me, but let's go to the 1700s. This will take 30 seconds. There was a king in Sweden who didn't trust his ministers. So he wanted to appoint people to watch his ministers. It then evolved in other countries in Europe where the outside monitor were the ministers watching the chief executive. And an ombudsman means go-between, between the people who overall don't have that much power individually, of course, and the people who have power over them. In the 1960s, a guy named Ralph Nader was a law student speaking 6 languages, traveled the world, and was not known. Went to Sweden, studied the Ombudsman program, and helped bring it back to the country to proselytize for it. It kind of caught on in New York and Jamestown, a small upstate city, with a mayor named Stan Lundin. He later became the lieutenant governor under Mario Cuomo. And then in New York City in 1975, a quite prominent city council member proposed adding it to the role of being president of the city council to give them more teeth and more connection and more sway in the body politic. I became public advocate in 1993, served until 1991. That history, briefly said, showed me that there was a possibility of combining Ralph Nader and the GAO. That is someone who is a watchdog, but also had a kind of voice, not a congressperson, not an executive, but like the GAO, blowing the whistle on things that were problems and proposing alternatives. I will now list just a handful of things to do and don't do if you want to survive, because some have not, like in New Jersey, and some have, like in New York City, although Rupert Murdoch's New York Post, a mayor named Rudy Giuliani, I lost track of him. Where did he ever end up? I'll tell you. But before he became a pathetic criminal, he was a very powerful mayor, and he constantly tried to eliminate me and my office, which made my work seriously exciting. First, to amplify what Jumaane said, you need an independent budget. There came a time early in my term where he wanted to zero out our budget. And I started to enlist David Boies, the famous lawyer, to bring an action against him, but he couldn't get it through the city council. But he tried. It ended up that every year there would be a fight over the budget, which was small compared to other budgets, until and when we figured out, and it succeeded recently, that it became a percentage of some other fixed number, because otherwise it could bounce up and down depending on the whim of the chief executive, be it governor or mayor. And so it's a percentage of the executive office. So a mayor doesn't want to shrink his office just to get the public advocate. Second, you really have to emphasize the office's independence. If it's named by the king, a mayor or a governor, it could lose its job when it does its job. And so when I did certain things, it would necessarily offend a sitting mayor, an executive, etc. And so when you're independently elected and your sovereignty, your power comes from voters, it does a couple of things. One, it's much harder to eliminate. Two, it helps you when you call agencies to get information and to pry out problems. And three, it works if you try to become well-known, part of which is done by getting elected. And the other part, what I did and all of us did to más o menos, is stay in the news, be visible, be a straight shooter, not a Dem or a Republican necessarily. And that enabled you to have the stature. It enabled me to have the stature to go against a man who eventually became America's mayor before he had an O.J. and Bill Cosby type moment and collapsed. And so it worked for, I think, pretty well. We survived the assault of people who didn't want us to exist. It's great if the office has a complaint function. I think it was Baltimore who started 311, and then I brought it to New York. We now have had 20 million 311 calls over the last 20 years, plus the ability to answer individual complaints, not resolve them. That's up to the host agency. And by doing that, we became more well-known and got embedded into communities and people beyond media headlines because people knew they could come to us for help. And so we did 3 or 4 things systematically. One, investigate agencies. It's hard to find waste, fraud, and abuse, the easy term, and I would avoid it. But it's easy if your charter, as it did with us, gives you the power to investigate. Sort of like a super Freedom of Information Act, where you can spot problems. An individual council person can't because they just know his or her small district, so there may be something idiosyncratic to that place. But when you see it city or statewide, it gives you, and you can look to your pattern of complaints for problems. It empowers you. Second is to propose alternatives. And if you do that and you have a good factual basis and a good pulpit, media pulpit and public pulpit, well, then we got 311 enacted in New York. I sued the police department for its racial bias. Giuliani tried to stop us, but we won. We proposed eliminating cigarette vending machines and ads at Shea and Yankee stadiums and seducing children. That got enacted. And we created the first matching system of small donors multiplied. Then it was 4 to 1 we got, and now it's 8 to 1. And in an era of online fundraising, you can see how those numbers can grow and keep you relatively independent of big donations. To conclude, before questions, I realized when I started that I had to have a model in my head. Anybody will tell you if you're a candidate, an author. Bob Caro said he writes the first sentence and then the last sentence. So he has a through line, a theme to what you're doing. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have, like them or not, they're thematic, they're consistent. And so I was a narrator, I am a lawyer, and I was a progressive advocate. And hence the model of a Ralph Nader and a GAO came to mind. So I ran saying to people I was going to create a public interest law firm representing people who consumers have power in the marketplace, sort of, but they don't have power because it's hard to organize in New York City, 8 million people, or nationally 330 million people. But through the voice of a public interest law firm who can investigate, sue, propose, and answer complaints, you had something that really had roots. Let me say, this is hard to get a hold of, but I'll hold it up. Trust me, it's not a popular book. I wrote an article with my general counsel, Laurel Eisner, at the end of my term for the New York Law School Law Review, not NYU, but the New York Law School Law Review in 1999. And the article was a public advocate of New York City, an analysis of the country's only elected ombudsman. And so anybody who's interested in getting that, I think it would help lay out what we did right and wrong, the problems we had, the successes we may have had, so people can learn from our experience.
Thank you so much, Mark Green. So many wonderful nuggets in there of ways that a public advocate can be transformative. We're very excited about the generative aspect of this policy, the idea that 311 came out of that, the idea that matching funds came out of that. This is not just one policy among many. It's a model that can generate the policies that you need into the future. Let's go to another public advocate. We have Betsy Gottbaum here. She was also in office 8 years right after Mark, issued dozens of reports, watchdogging the 311 system, the school system, public benefits distribution. Same question to you, Betsy. Tell us about your experience as public advocate and what lessons you learned that would be useful as this audience here, dozens of states, hundreds of state legislators and staffers that replied, RSVP'd for this, who want to bring this to other states and cities. What can they learn from your experience?
Oh, well, thank you very much for doing this. And I think it's a very important thing to do. I think if other states could do it, I'd like to reiterate what both Mark and Jumaane said, that it is a really important office. And we had some very similar times. Mark, a lot of things that Mark said happened to me too, and I'll very quickly repeat that. But I do want to leave the audience with, if you ever want to do this, I'd be more than happy to try to help you put it together, because not only do I agree with Mark that many of the same things, the pitfalls happened to me that had happened to him, and that made me move the office in a little bit of a different direction, which I will say, and very quickly, let me quickly give you a little history. I'm glad Mark gave you much more history. When I came to office, our election day was 9/11, 2001. So the election was postponed, and we had another election, I think 3 weeks later, which was a very shocking and horrible time, as many of you remember. And after the election, I took office in 2002. And right away, from the very beginning, my role as the watchdog over the new mayor, Michael Bloomberg, was not to his liking. And he very soon on, after we both took office, tried to do what Giuliani tried to do with Mark Green. He tried to get rid of me and the office. And because I had been legitimately elected by the city and by the people, it would have been very clear that if he had done that, there could have been a lot of lawsuits. And I think somebody told him that, or somebody advised him not to do it. So he backed off, although he did try to get rid of me and the office. And that's kind of similar to what happened to Mark. Anyway, and by the way, Mike Bloomberg and I have become friends again. We had been very good friends before. But anyway, so to continue, I found right away that because the resources were so few for the public advocate's office with what I felt we were supposed to do, I set up a not-for-profit attached to the Public Advocate's Office called the Fund for Public Advocacy. And that I could go into more directly if anybody's interested, but I needed more money to do some of the things that I needed to do. The thing that I emphasized and focused on was the Ombudsman role of getting complaints from citizens, looking into those complaints, seeing if they were citywide, because as Mark said, this is an enormous city, seeing if some of those complaints were citywide. And if they were citywide, there you had what I used to call a bingo. Now you would then, let's just give an example and make it more easy for you and for me. But let's say that you had a stream of water bills all over Queens and Brooklyn that were increasing at an enormous rate. So you see that, you call the water board or it's one of the agencies in the city, and you say, what's going on here? We have all these complaints and blah, blah, blah. And if it got to the point that I should get involved because nothing was happening, I would get involved and I would call the commissioner. And they were very, very responsive. My understanding was that Giuliani told his commissioners, by the way, never to speak to Mark Green. I had the opposite effect. I was able to talk to the commissioners and they were very responsive to me. So I felt, and I still do feel, that people really need a place to turn. Most people don't know where to turn. They don't know what to do. They do need help. And so I felt that role of the public advocate was the one that I emphasized the most. And for me, it was very satisfactory because that did lead me to trying to solve, or solving in some cases or not, problems in education, problems about homelessness, problems about people not getting their checks, their assistance checks, all that. These were all things that we as an office were able to do. And that was very satisfactory. Now, 311 was begun, and it is a very good system. But I always felt that 311 and the Public Advocate's Office should be linked together. So let's go back to the example of the water bills. Let's say that Public Advocate's Office got all these complaints about water bills, and there was some system with 311 where we were able to we could link up and find out, did 311 get these complaints about water bills? And if they did, we'd combine the efforts to do something about that particular issue with the two organizations, 311 and the Public Advocate's Office, working hard to solve people's problems. In this case, it would have been making the water bills lower than they should have, than they were. And to me, that was the real point and emphasis on the office at that particular point. Now, there were other things too, and I agree with what both Mark and Jumaane said, that, because you're elected citywide, you have a bully pulpit. I disagree about that you need subpoena power. I doubt very much that it's going to happen. It certainly wouldn't happen. I don't think it would happen in New York State. But I don't think you really need it. I think if you strategize in a way that I just suggested, like combining it with a centralized complaint system like 311, you could be an extremely powerful force that helps people where they really need it. So that's basically what I emphasized the most. It was a very interesting job. I would make 3 points. One, as Mark said, and I think Jumaane said it, you've got to have an independent budget. The person that you're watching, the watchdog that you're watching, the watchdog that you are, you must not be, that person may not or must not control your budget. Every time the mayor got mad at me, there was an attempt to cut the budget. So that is one thing, an independent budget that is set, that nobody can take it away, particularly the mayor can't take it away. 2, I would combine I would be very clear on the public advocate's role and the things that the public advocate can and cannot do, because that was never carefully defined, at least when I was public advocate. And 3, I would really emphasize the complaint function of the office, because so many people, I'm sure in every city in this country, or in every county, people really need a place to turn to. And to me, that's the role of government. So on that note, I will finish.
Thank you so much, Betsy Gottbaum. So appreciate this. We will hopefully have questions at the end for both Mark and Betsy, but I want to get Ron Chen in here before we open up to questions. Ron Chen is not a New York City public advocate. He was a New Jersey state public advocate. It was not elected, it was appointed. And they've had it since it was a trailblazing idea in the 70s. Then it was rolled back. Then it was brought back, and Ron Chen was public advocate. Then it was rolled back by Chris Christie again. So could you tell us what it was like, Ron, to be a statewide public advocate and how you navigated this revived office, especially at a time when you were surrounded by governors that on each end of the governor you were under that were kind of against the public advocate office?
Right. Well, Peter, I think you sort of lay out the conundrum of New Jersey's version of the public advocate. I was not elected. I would be absolutely hopeless trying to run for public office. I'm a law professor, and I think for that reason, I had coming in the benefit that the person who appointed me, Governor John Corzine, campaigned on the issue of restoring the public advocate, which in fact had already been restored by the legislature. As a principal department of state government, I was a member of the governor's cabinet. I went to all the cabinet meetings. It was a little bit surreal because among the powers that the public advocate department had been was given in its original iteration in 1973 was the power to initiate litigation, including against a governmental agency. So I would come to cabinet meetings and the room would part, wondering if I was actually going to sue them. The department had administrative subpoena power. In New Jersey, administrative subpoena, which is as apart from a judicial subpoena, it's not self-executing. If someone doesn't obey it, then you have to go into court and have it enforced, which I did on occasion in a few discrete areas, but it was there. And the idea was to merge all the disparate functions of advocacy for the corrections ombudsman, the ratepayer advocate, mental health guardian who represents civil commitment, who represents people in civil commitment proceedings, institutionalized elderly and developmentally disabled students, to marshal all those offices of government into one department, so it had some cohesive force, and also a division particularly to receive citizen complaints. But I think the power that was the most controversial, and probably eventually it spelled both the success and then the doom, at least for the moment, for the Department of the Public Advocate, was this power in the Division of Public Interest Advocacy to sue. So if I found something that local or state government was doing that I felt was against the public interest, and I thought that was a legal argument, I was given standing to sue. Technically, I would sue in my own name, but so a case such as Chen versus Corzine, my boss who appointed me, was possible. I did not do it because in the first 4 years of Governor Corzine's administration, which, as you remember, ended up being the last 4 years of Governor Corzine's administration, I was frankly busy with the administrative task of reinflating what was a principal department of state government, which was quite a task. In the original iteration of the Department of the Public Advocate, it also contained in but not of the department was the Office of the Public Defender, obviously representing indigent criminal defendants. That was not true in my case, which was actually just as well for me. I guess the assumption behind the New Jersey Department of the Public Advocate is that you could have contained within the innermost workings of state government someone whose job ultimately would be to initiate proceedings or call someone out, even though it could be your cabinet colleague. I've thought a lot about in the last 11 years of whether that model is workable or not. I obviously went into the job thinking it was. Obviously, the history of the New Jersey Department of the Public Advocate could suggest there are some problems. It exists. It was founded first in 1973. It lasted for not quite 20 years. Then when Governor Whitman came in, she abolished it. There were 5 public advocates who engaged in fairly controversial litigation sometimes. There was one cabinet meeting when one of my predecessors, who was also, he's passed away now, a prior colleague of mine on the law faculty at Rutgers Law School, literally sued several of his cabinet colleagues, in some cases in their personal capacity, which did not make for pleasant conversations. But I mean, he told me the reason he did it. I did not do that. Frankly, I was getting ready to on one issue involving treatment of children of immigrants. And I told the governor I was getting ready to do that. And he actually agreed with me. Then we had an election. Governor Corzine was out. I was out back teaching contracts at Rutgers Law School. I actually took the issue and represented privately on the same issue as a volunteer attorney for the ACLU, where I'm on the national board and I'm a general counsel of the ACLU now. You know, I think it is a subject worthy of discussion of whether that model, where you are both part of inside government, but obviously for some reasons outside government, how that will work. Obviously, a lot of it depends on the political tenor of the times. Here in New Jersey, I mean, when Governor Christie came in, he basically struck a deal with the leaders of the legislature, even though the New Jersey legislature was Democratic, to get rid of it. And so much of it, of course, was also driven by the budget, even though we were a principal department of state government, which in New Jersey is constitutionally limited. You can't have more than 20 of them. I think we were the 18th at the time, but by far the smallest budget-wise. Other cabinet members were arranging for their drivers and their cars. If the governor called my office, well, I would pick up the phone because it was me and the chief of staff for the first few weeks. So staffing up was somewhat of an issue, and also then picking the issues that were most on people's minds at the time. The one issue I picked up initially was use of eminent domain for redevelopment. The Supreme Court had recently issued a controversial case that essentially allowed redevelopment to take someone's private home, not because it was blighted, but simply because they needed it for economic development. Some of you lawyers would know the Kelo case. And that was quite controversial. And so the governors even suggested that I take that up, which I did. And I used, since the public advocate had to be a lawyer, the public advocate and the attorney general are the 2 cabinet officers that had to be lawyers. I made it especially of my office to try to use the New Jersey state constitution and as ways to expand public rights, the public interest and civil rights, because we have a very active New Jersey Supreme Court that interprets the state constitution broadly and engendered some success. Ironically, I probably pissed off the Democrats more than I did the Republicans on that. There were several hearings in which the Republicans were actually praising what I was doing and the Democrats were not. So it was a very complex political issue. I'm not a politician. I'm now happily ensconced after my 4-year foray into state government, back being a law professor. And I still think upon it. It's a legitimate question. Representative Stewart, I'd be glad to talk to you about it. A statewide public defender's, public advocate's office, how it is structured to protect its independence, which obviously was quite important. I wouldn't have taken the job if Governor Corzine hadn't pledged that independence to me, even if it meant, Governor, if I have to sue you, you know it's nothing personal, but I'll do it. And he said yes, and that's fine on a personal level, but structurally, how do you create that independence? And is there something to have someone in state government where obviously the hope was that before I did that, I would call up a colleague, the commissioner of community affairs or health. Obviously, I've been thinking a lot now, what would the Department of the Public Advocate, what its role would have been in this pandemic? I think I would like to believe that we would have been very, very busy trying to balance a whole host of issues. And a number of issues have come up in New Jersey in the 11 years that the department was last eliminated, where I thought, geez, if we'd been there, we could have facilitated this. The problems in the prisons, in our women's prisons, in corrections, a lot of issues that I was dealing with day to day. And what happened to the Department of the Public Advocate, I was telling Mark Green this before, Chris Christie struck a deal. It was eliminated because he thought it was a waste of money. Why should we pay someone to sue government? But the reality is 75 to 80% of the department is still there. It was just redistributed in other elements of government, isolated. They're now standalone offices. So the entire, I know the representative who sent who introduced the abolition bill, the elimination bill, who happened to be a law school classmate of mine, and we're friendly, even though politically we're quite separate, said he was very disappointed when he found out the entire budgetary impact of eliminating the Department of the Public Advocate, according to the Office of Legislative Services, would be about $5 million a year, which in this state budget of New Jersey was frankly loose change. It just didn't resonate. But that's so right now I am the last public advocate of New Jersey. I know there is occasionally talk. Governor Murphy talked about it in the campaign about restoring it. And obviously, I would love to have conversations about that. There may be ways to do this better on a statewide basis. I think I'm sure I made some mistakes in some ways. Some things I would do differently. But the concept of trying to have coherent, cohesive advocacy for all aspects of the public needs was what appealed to me in taking the job. And I still think it has a lot of resonance to it.
Thank you so much, Ron Chen. So many, I'm seeing themes that are popping up in all of these statements, you know, independent power, independent budgets, the need to have teeth, or the ability to do things when you have certain teeth and others not having certain teeth, the ability of being both inside and outside the government, the power of the bully pulpit, the ability to respond to new things that arise, like a pandemic, like crises in different situations that an outsider insider has a bigger power to. So thank you all, Mark and Betsy and Ronald, for sharing that. We're coming up on time. Some of the panelists have said they're willing to stay a little after if questions want to pile in, but I want to have a formal ending for people who do want to leave. And I thought I'd end with Delegate Stewart. Could you just give us a rundown of what your next steps are on pushing this? You know, is it being submitted next session? You know, how are you thinking of advocating for this, and how can people help who are in Maryland? And then we'll throw it back to me to close it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, thank you all so much, both the panelists for your time and your insights and your wisdom, and also all of y'all for joining us this afternoon/evening. This is really, really, really exciting for me and was really instructive. And thanks to everyone for your wisdom, all the former and current public advocates. It was really invaluable. I mean, essentially the process going forward is pretty straightforward. I've actually pre-filed legislation to create a public advocate office in the 2022 legislative session in Annapolis for the Maryland General Assembly. And so what that means is the bill will be up on the website as an officially filed bill here within a few weeks. The session begins on January the 12th, which means that there will be a public hearing on this bill in probably either late January or early February. We won't know until about a week or so prior to the hearing when exactly that will be. And it'll be a virtual hearing where, you know, I will testify. There'll be panelists. Hopefully there'll be no opposition, but there'll probably be some opponents. And there'll absolutely be an opportunity for anyone who wants to get engaged. I'm sure, you know, Pete, you can help folks sort of shepherd people into the process of participating, whether you're in Maryland or not, to voice your support for the legislation. There'll be an opportunity to submit written testimony, submit testify sort of virtually and orally. Certainly, Ron, Mark, you know, those of you who have done this before, if you want to come testify virtually in Annapolis, we would love to have you. And And then there's also an opportunity, whether or not you're in Maryland or not, to send emails to legislators to voice your support for this. And even if you don't live in Maryland, you can say that you're rooting for the Maryland legislation to serve as a potential model for your state and for the rest of the country. And then, assuming things move forward, we would vote the bill out. We got to get it out of both chambers. We got to get it through a potential veto from Governor Hogan. And then if it passes, it would actually become a constitutional amendment that would be on the ballot in November 2022, that the voters would then have a say over whether this is an office that we would create or not. I'm very confident that it would pass a public vote overwhelmingly. So the tough part is the legislative process. And so to the extent that any of y'all want to be helpful or want to get involved, I'm sure Pete will provide an opportunity. I'm sure he will send my email address out to everyone. If you do want to be involved, I will post it in the chat rather than say it out loud after I'm done talking. But if you have any interest or any expertise or any wisdom or insight or want to get involved, please don't hesitate to reach out. But again, this has been amazing. Thank you so much to Pete and to Deepen. Thanks to everyone who on the panel. Thanks to everyone for coming. This is super awesome. I couldn't be more excited to sort of take this torch. I hope I don't let you down, and onward.
Thank you so much, Delegate Stewart. And that's to help out in Maryland. And if you want to bring this model so that Delegate Stewart's not the only one pushing it next year to your state as well, please reach out. My email is pete@democracypolicy.network. If you go to democracypolicy.network and join, we will also help with that. And everyone who's on this will get info about all the panelists, about Delegate Stewart's inspiring bill, and about how you can bring this to your state as well. We have some folks that might stay on to be able to answer questions, but I want to, since we're at time, give everyone an opportunity to leave if they need to. And thank you so much for everyone for participating. Thank you. Onward to a deeper democracy. Now, as people are clicking out, and we are willing to answer questions in the chat, we'll probably go another 15 minutes or so. We got a question about the charter cop aspect of the public advocate. So this is mostly for Mark and Betsy, if either of you are staying on. This idea of the advocate as a charter cop, what does that mean? That Advocate Williams mentioned. And be sure to unmute if you're gonna answer. I think Mark, you're muted. And Betsy, you're muted too. Still muted. Yeah, unmuted.
Okay. I use the term charter cop because it enhanced the watchdog function, and the public advocate was put into our city charter, sort of our constitution. And it said that we have the ability to oversee agencies and get information. And so when I inquired to get records of police officers with substantiated complaints against them, many, in order to expose the problem of police misconduct and racial misconduct, Jumaane told his police commissioner, don't respond. And so I was able, by saying I was a charter cop, which is legislatively true, that I could go to court and went to 3 courts, like 8 judges ruled and 8-0. They ruled in our favor. And so that helped give me leverage, of course, over other agencies. Let me add, when you were talking about the popularity of the office, and Betsy said that Mike Bloomberg is a good guy, but a bit of a CEO mentality. Oh, you didn't know that. And Rudy Giuliani may not be a good guy, but he has a kind of tyrannical temperament. So if your chief executive has either a tyrannical or monarchical view, you're not going to survive unless you're independent, popular, and outside his or her ability. So during my term, there came a moment where Giuliani just had it with me, and he proposed to eliminate one of my authorities, which was under the law. I was next in line to him were there a vacancy, and he was thinking about running for the U.S. Senate. which he almost did. And he wasn't happy about thinking of running, leaving, and that I would succeed him. So he proposed to eliminate that succession. And I warned him not to do it because I beat him in a referendum. He went forward. He lost 3-1 in a public vote. And so that slowed him down in going after me. So again, you need a popular support for your legal or legislative initiatives to have them occur.
Thank you for that, Mark. Betsy, if you're still on the call, we got a question in the chat of, are there good models for structured forms of community engagement, like community advisory boards that give community or work organizations a formal ongoing role in informing and collaborating with public advocates? And this was a special thing we focused on in the bill with Vaughn, because we were interested in expanding the public advocate role to not just be kind of a technical watchdog, but to really be a place where the citizenry meets the government beyond just the fact that the citizenry elects the government. So in your focus on processing complaints and setting up these new systems, and in your role as a decades-long community advocate in New York, what do you think about that question about structured forms of community engagement with the public advocate, Betsy? And you're on mute right now, so just make sure to unmute. And I think it has to be unmuted on your phone specifically. I'm still muted. Let's see, unfortunately. Still coming in muted. You might have to call in one more time. While we're waiting for Betsy to call in, we got a question from Rob Kwan, and Mike, if you could help Betsy call in on that. We got a question from Rob Kwan on how is the New York City Public Advocate involved in actual council meetings beyond introducing and seconding motion? To what extent do they participate in discussion of items at meetings? Mark, if you could speak to that.
When I became public advocate, the custom was that I presided over the city council. Like Vice President Harris can preside but not vote other than in a tie over the US Senate. And it was useful. It got me engaged with other council members. When I proposed something, I could more easily meet with and solicit co-sponsors. That ended shortly after I left, mostly because the real speaker of the city council, I mean, not Vice President Harris, but Chuck Schumer, by analogy, kind of didn't like the idea that I had that presiding function. But I didn't find it a terrible loss of power. But the co-sponsorship thing was great, because when I had what I regard as a good idea, I didn't have the influence in the council to get it enacted, but our speaker, a man named Peter Vallone from Queens, did. And so I would go to him, offer that he be the lead sponsor, which I did on the matter of the 4-to-1 matching funds, for example. Some of our tobacco initiatives. So he was happy with that. And the more friends you make, the better. If I could, until when Betsy's back, give me 30 seconds on community involvement. Creating in New York City, there are 59 community boards. Because the city is so enormous, you want some local access. Just to create advisory councils like you do for a political campaign is kind of honorific, and it could be more bothersome than helpful. However, I pledged and did have a town hall meeting in each of the 59 community boards. So it took time, obviously, but it would be widely publicized in that area. And now, unlike then, with online communications, a lot of people could log on watch and or ask questions of you in each community. So you could talk to the problem of policing in Bed-Stuy, which may be different than Little Neck. That immersed me in a rather, and can now immerse a new public advocate into the community, again, enhancing its prominence and its effectiveness.
Thank you for that, Mark. Betsy, were you able to unmute? Okay, still working on the audio there. We have a question in the chat for Ron Chen, if you're still with us, Ron. With many of the divisions and ombudsmen that were part of the NJDPA, Department of the Public Advocate, now in other departments for 11 years, what do you think is the possibility of getting these entities back under an NJ, Department of the Public Advocate, along with their budgets? And I'll expand on that question also, which is, what is the benefit of bringing all of them into one office? Because you occasionally, you know, when we sent out this event, some people wrote to us and said, oh, we're fighting for a Department of Health Advocate, Health Public Advocate, or a Disability Public Advocate, or Children's Public Advocate. And what is the benefit of bringing it all together, and what do you see as the prospects of that in New Jersey?
I mean, essentially, that question asked me, how could we duplicate what you tried to do in 2006 in bringing all these very, very different type of functions in? I had the corrections ombudsman dealing with inmate advocacy, and the ratepayer advocate dealing with utility law and mental health and institutionalized elderly, all of whom sort of had been used to being somewhat autonomous. Is it a struggle to build a common culture, which is what we tried to do? Each of them had their own expertise, and I didn't want to try to second guess them on the best way to argument to make as far as conditions in a nursing home, et cetera. But we tried to instill a common sense of advocacy, of particularly giving a voice you did not have to members of the public who, for various reasons, had no effective voice on their own. Yes, I think it can be done. It is a lot of work. That's frankly what took up a lot of my time. It's behind the scenes, dealing with public employees who have developed a culture on their own. And now that those departments, those offices, and those functions have been sort of redistributed. A few went back to the public defender. Many of them became independent agencies that are probably technically in but of either the Department of State or the Department of the Treasury, which means they sort of float. The benefit to some state employees is that out of sight, out of mind, no one bothers them. But the detriment to that is that you don't have someone at a high enough level like a commissioner, a cabinet member, who can bring something to the attention of the governor. I got to admit, I have, as I've been watching for those in New Jersey, there's been a very bad situation that has become to light over the conditions in the Edna Mahan Women's Corrections Facility, essentially New Jersey's prison for women, a facility that I visited several times through the auspices of the Office of the Corrections Ombudsman, and I keep on wondering what could we have done at the time. And now there is a bill that has passed to have a souped up corrections ombudsman just for corrections that has come out of that. But that's issue by issue. Rate Council, the Rate Council I appointed, in fact, just retired a few weeks ago, is extremely important work, very technical. Utility law is very, very technical, but just given the amount of money involved, the ratepayer is extremely important. Trying to instill that common sense of advocacy to the public, that was my goal. I think it can be done, but it is a challenge.
Thank you, Ron. We, on the benefits of kind of cohering this into one office, we have Betsy on the phone through Mike's account. So Mike, if you can unmute Betsy, you'll be able to answer some of the questions, the last few questions on community engagement, on bringing it all together in one office, on the interaction with the council.
Well, I'm sorry, I missed part of that, but that the interaction with the council in New York is you preside over the city council. And that gives you, although in New York, the person presiding isn't the real power is the speaker. But the fact that you are there and you kind of, you intervene in disputes and stuff is somewhat important. But I think the one question that was really important and should be emphasized is any community input, whatever the vehicle is, if it's a community board, if it's a action committee, whatever, those should all be organizations that the public advocate responds to, knows who they are. It's very important. The more community investments you get. One of the things that I will emphasize, what it does come down to is individuals knowing where they can call when they have some problem. Because you get, in a city like New York anyway, you get lots and lots of problems that are generic to the whole city. And that's what I always used to say, that's a big problem. I gave you the example of the water bills. There were many more serious examples of stuff in the Department of Education, for example. So you get one or two calls from individuals, and then those allow you to look into what those individuals are talking about. And if they're really serious, which in many instances they were, then that becomes a very important aspect of the public advocate's office.
And could you talk just, I know you have to go in a minute, but could you talk just for 1 minute on how the kind of the technical elements of receiving these complaints and the innovation your office did in your 8 years over, how do you use 311? How do you receive complaints through the internet? How do you, what is kind of the day-to-day life there?
Okay, first of all, the innovative idea of connecting with 311, the mayor never wanted to let it happen. So that just didn't happen. And I always thought it was a very good idea that could have been done technically. And I don't know how that could happen, but many people that I talked to said it could happen, that there would be a way to connect with 311 that would be very useful. That was an idea I had after being there for 7 years. The main way in which we got the information from people was twofold. One, we had a group of ombudsmen, they were called, and they were on the phone from like 8 o'clock in the morning, and then others came in until about 6 or 7 o'clock at night. And they would take calls from people calling into the public advocate's office. That was a very important way of doing it. Another way of doing it was the fact that I was out and about and was in the paper quite often, and people would call me. And there were calls, but the most efficient way was having a call center where people got to call in, and the people who answered the phones became very astute and very clever at figuring out what to do to help those people. Remember, 311 is a referral. You call 311 about the water bill, they'll refer you to the water board or to the Department of Environmental Protection. They won't solve the problem. We tried to solve the problem. And I think in coordinating with 311, the two forces solving a problem, the mayor's agency, which is what 311 comes under, plus the public advocate, that's a pretty strong force in a city like New York. And in a smaller city, it would seem to me that it would be a tremendous force and a very good force. And I can't emphasize enough how government is supposed to be helping people. And that was my real emphasis there. Let's try to help as many people as we can. Now, limits, we didn't have enough budget, but I see it still, after 8 years of doing it, as something crucial to running a city well. If I were a mayor, I would want a public advocate.
What a great note there. It's such an important aspect of having an independent agency doing this. The mayor or the governor has to worry about the day-to-day structural governing, but having an independent entity that's dealing with the actual where the rubber hits the road of liaisoning between the people and the government is so important. Thank you for that, Betsy. We need to wrap up, so I want to give, since we're talking about a new wave of public advocacy, fights. I'd love to give kind of the original public advocate the last word here, Mark Green, to give your final rallying cry and word of encouragement and advice to the folks on the call that want to bring this to their state and city. Any last words? A minute to you, Mark Green, and then we'll close up.
Thank you. It is a great idea from the 1700s to today, especially when you have a kind of unaccountable chief executive from either party, that you can't make the public advocate part of the governor or mayor's operation. Like the New Jersey, Ron said that he could sue Corzine. That's destined to fail. And so we didn't need that because we had the bully pulpit, ability to introduce legislation, ability to propose solutions, and then organize people around it. One more point in addition, we have not mentioned, but it's pretty important. You may not be a politician before, but if you're elected public advocate, sure as hell a politician then. And I'm sure it's not a coincidence, but of the 5 public advocates, Betsy shrewdly never ran for office again. 2 of the others ran for mayor, and Bill de Blasio won. One of the others ran for attorney general, Tish James. She is currently the attorney general. Another, you heard from Jumaane Williams, is currently running for governor. And I mention that because you could run into political problems from envious or rivalrous politicians because there's just so many slots. You have to try to be accommodating to those you're not taking into court. Another argument in favor of public advocate, it's not the leading argument, but it is an argument, is that it creates another office for excluded communities to hold office. So, for example, until Andrew Cuomo's problems, New York had never had a female governor. And now, not by election, but by succession, we do. And I was succeeded by a woman who was succeeded by a Black woman who's been now succeeded by a Black councilman. And so it enables different communities to rise, serve. And it's sort of the way, forgive me by analogy, Pete Buttigieg wasn't able to become president, but now he's in a high office by appointment, of course, at the Department of Transportation. And so it gives an opportunity. We've never had an openly gay public citywide official, admitted openly a gay public official. And so that would be, we've never really had a citywide Latino public official. And that would be, and there isn't not one now in a city that is 20% Latino. So those are small d democratic pluses, and it adds to the cachet and stature of the public advocate. So whoever runs for it, be it a kind of more of an activist like Jumaane or Betsy, who is extremely well known by administrators and the not-for-profit communities, when you're serving as it, you don't want to pick favorites, but you want to use your political skills to stay popular, get bills passed. And if you're going to step on toes, step on the right ones. You can't sue your own boss. That's not a good idea.
I like that as a final note, because it's another argument as you're lobbying for this. We got a question that you could pass this by ballot initiative. I think the public would be very into this. But as you're lobbying for this, you know, all of these politicians are interested in more slots for them to reach statewide office, whether it's for the cause of representation or just, you know, any politician wants more slots that they can run for. This is another slot. So that might get you a yes vote in some of this lobbying. But back to the mission, we're so excited that this is aspect that can deepen democracy and be generative of other democratic reforms and bring the government closer to the people. Thank you so much, Betsy Gottbaum. Thank you, Mark Green. Thank you, Ron Chen. And thank you, Delegate Vaughn Stewart, for submitting this new wave, the beginning of the new wave of public advocate legislation. And thank you to all of you for watching, and all of you watching afterwards on the recording. Let's fight for a deeper democracy. Thank you, everyone.